The Andrews sisters were World War II icons and sold 75 million records. But in 1953, Patty Andrews betrayed her sisters in the worst way possible. She didn't just quit, she sued them, stole their inheritance, and never spoke to them again. But that betrayal was just the beginning. From secret overdoses to backstabbing marriages, here's the dark story of how America's favorite singing trio destroyed each other. The Andrews sisters grew up in a home where struggle and music went hand in hand. Their father, Peter Andreas, had left Greece to build a new life in Minneapolis. He found work in an ice cream factory, then later opened a restaurant. That's where he met Olga Soli, a Norwegian woman raised in the Lutheran faith. Her family didn't approve of the marriage at first, but when Laverne was born in 1911, they slowly came around. Life was never easy for the family. Before Maxine was born in 1916, Peter and Olga lost their second child, Anglin, who died at just 8 months old. That loss left a mark on them, shaping how they raised their daughters. They poured everything into Laverne, Maxine, and Patty, especially when it came to music. From a young age, the sisters spent hours singing together. Laverne played piano, while the younger two followed her lead. They loved listening to the Boswell sisters, a jazz trio known for their tight harmonies and playful rhythms. They mimicked their idols, studied their recordings, and found their own voices along the way. Singing wasn't just something they did for fun. It became their way forward. When the Great Depression hit, their father's restaurant didn't survive. With no steady income, the family faced a tough reality. That was when the sisters made a decision that would change their lives. They took their music on the road, performing anywhere they could. School dances, vaudeville shows, silent movie theaters. Wherever there was a stage, they sang. Some nights, they barely made enough to get by, but their voices kept them going. The Andrews sisters got their start when vaudeville was on its last legs. They were born in Minneapolis to Greek-Norwegian parents and grew up obsessed with the Boswell sisters, a harmony group that was big in the 1920s. Their mother, Olga, saw their potential and encouraged them to pursue music. In 1931, they won a talent contest at the Orpheum Theater, a moment that changed everything. That victory led them to join Larry Rich's traveling vaudeville troupe, throwing them straight into the tough world of live entertainment. Vaudeville was no easy place to make it. Patty Andrews later said performers would do whatever it took to get ahead. Some even tried to sabotage each other. But the sisters took every challenge as a lesson. They learned how to work an audience, how to add humor to their act, and how to fine-tune their harmonies. Those early years on the road shaped them into the performers they would become. In the early 1930s, they started touring with RKO's unit shows, performing in theaters all over the Midwest. By then, movies were taking over, and vaudeville was fading fast. Maxine later joked that they must have closed every RKO theater in the Midwest, a reminder of just how many places they had performed. Even as the industry shifted, they kept pushing forward, blending swing music with their signature harmonies. They didn't know it yet, but their big moment was just around the corner. In 1937, they recorded Bei mir bist du schön, a song originally written in Yiddish for a 1932 musical. Sammy Cahn and Saul Chaplin reworked the lyrics into English, and Jack Kapp, the head of Decca Records, decided to take a chance on the sisters. The song came out right after Christmas, and within days, it exploded in popularity. By New Year's Eve, it was the most played song on New York radio. It sold over 1 million copies, making the Andrews sisters the first female group to hit that milestone. But despite the song's massive success, they were only paid $50 because of a bad contract. The song wasn't just a hit, it was everywhere. Its swing rhythm and catchy melody made it popular across the world, even in Nazi Germany, until officials discovered its Jewish origins and banned it. But in America, it launched the sisters to stardom. Their harmonies didn't just blend, they mimicked instruments, layering their voices like a brass section in a swing band. That unique sound set them apart and made them pioneers of the swing era. Signing with Decca in 1937 turned out to be one of the smartest moves of their career. It led them to work with Vic Schoen, a brilliant arranger who helped define their sound. He pushed them to experiment with complex harmonies and new rhythms, and the results were unforgettable. Over their career, they recorded more than 400 songs and sold over 80 million records. Songs like Beer Barrel Polka, Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, and Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree proved they could do more than just swing. They could handle boogie woogie, jazz, and even calypso. Critics often said their voices sounded like three trumpets playing in perfect sync. Their partnership with Schoen didn't just shape their recordings. His arrangements also gave them an edge on live radio, especially on shows like Glenn Miller's Chesterfield Show, where they switched effortlessly between upbeat swing numbers and heartfelt ballads. During World War II, the Andrews sisters did more than sing. They gave soldiers a reason to smile when the world felt uncertain. Laverne, Maxine, and Patty Andrews became known as America's wartime sweethearts because their music brought comfort to those fighting far from home. Their songs weren't just hits. They became part of the war itself, lifting spirits and reminding people of what they were fighting for. One of their most famous songs, Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, told the story of a jazz-loving soldier drafted into the army. It had an infectious rhythm that made it impossible to sit still. Soldiers played it in barracks, danced to it at canteens, and carried it with them wherever they went. Another hit, Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree, captured the longing of couples separated by war. It wasn't just music, it was a connection to home. The sisters didn't stop at recording songs, they took action. They joined the USO, performing for troops across the country. They sang, danced, and spent time with soldiers who needed a break from the harsh reality of war. They volunteered at the Hollywood Canteen, where they didn't just perform, but also served food, chatted with servicemen, and made sure everyone felt welcome. Their energy was endless. They even recorded Any Bonds Today to encourage Americans to support the war effort by buying war bonds. Hollywood quickly took notice. In 1941, they starred in Buck Privates alongside Abbott and Costello. The film was a perfect mix of comedy, music, and patriotism. One scene in particular stood out when the sisters, dressed in military uniforms, performed Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy in front of a room full of soldiers. The energy was electric. The film became a massive hit, earning over $4 million and turning the Andrews sisters into national icons. Other films followed, like In the Navy and Private Buckaroo, each filled with humor and music that helped audiences escape from the stress of war. These movies weren't just entertainment. They kept morale high and reminded people that even in difficult times, there was still joy to be found. But the Andrews sisters weren't just singing about war, they were stepping into it. Between 1941 and 1945, they traveled to active combat zones to perform for troops. In 1944, they toured Italy and North Africa, sometimes singing just miles from enemy lines. The risk was real, but they never hesitated. They knew what their music meant to the soldiers. One moment stayed with Maxine Andrews forever. She remembered singing Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree to young men on the Seattle docks as they prepared to ship out to the Pacific. Many of them never returned. For those soldiers, hearing the Andrews sisters was more than just a performance. It was a reminder of home, family, and the life they were fighting to protect. By the time the war ended, USO shows had reached over 16 million servicemen and women. The Andrews sisters played a major role in that effort. They gave everything they had, traveling non-stop and putting their own comfort aside to make sure no soldier felt forgotten. By the mid-1940s, the Andrews sisters were at the top of the music industry. Their close harmony singing and lively performances made them one of the most successful acts in American history. At their peak, they earned $20,000 a week, which would be over $300,000 today. They sold more than 90 million records and recorded over 600 songs, including Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, Rum and Coca-Cola, and Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree. Their collaboration with Bing Crosby led to 47 recordings, and 23 of them became Billboard hits. They also starred in 17 Hollywood films and had their own radio shows on ABC and CBS. Their music defined an era. During World War II, their songs lifted spirits at home and on the front lines. They toured with the USO, performing for troops across the world. Some of their records were even smuggled into Nazi Germany under fake labels. Their voices brought comfort in a time of uncertainty. But behind the scenes, things were not as perfect as they seemed. Patty Andrews, the youngest and the group's lead singer, had a bright and outgoing personality. Maxine, the middle sister, was more serious and business-minded. Their differences led to frequent clashes, not just over music, but over everything from hairstyles to financial decisions. Maxine once said they were as different as three sisters could possibly be, and that the only thing keeping them together was the music. Tensions grew in 1941 when Maxine secretly married their manager, Lou Levy. She kept it hidden for a while, telling only Patty. When the truth came out, it caused a deep rift in the family. A decade later, in 1951, Patty made a decision that shocked everyone. Without telling her sisters, she left to pursue a solo career. The Andrews sisters fell apart, and for 2 years, they barely spoke. Through it all, Laverne Andrews, the eldest sister, did her best to hold the group together. She was calm and level-headed, often stepping in to ease tensions. She managed many of their daily operations and made sure they stayed focused. But she had her own struggles. She married musician Lou Rogers in 1948, but continued to put the group first, even as things became more difficult. Swing music was everywhere in the 1930s and early 1940s. It filled dance halls, played on every radio, and became the soundtrack of World War II. Soldiers marched off to war with swing in their ears, and couples danced to it before saying their goodbyes. But after the war, everything started to change. The bands that once ruled the music scene struggled to survive, and a new sound began to take over. One of the biggest reasons was money. During the war, the government placed heavy restrictions on travel. Gasoline was rationed, rubber was in short supply, and touring became difficult. Then, in 1944, a 30% tax was added to dance venues, making it even harder for big bands to perform. Many musicians had also been drafted, leaving bands without key players. Some never came back. When the war ended, America moved into a new era. People wanted something fresh, something that didn't remind them of years filled with loss and sacrifice. Swing, once the heartbeat of the country, started to feel like a thing of the past. At the same time, singers were becoming the new stars. A musicians' strike from 1942 to 1944 had stopped instrumentalists from recording new music, but vocalists weren't affected. This gave artists like Frank Sinatra a huge advantage. By the late 1940s, big band leaders were no longer the center of attention. Audiences were drawn to solo singers instead of full orchestras. Smaller bands also became more practical. They were cheaper to manage and easier to book, and they fit the new musical styles that were emerging. Bebop was gaining popularity, a faster and more complex style of jazz that focused on individual musicians instead of large groups. Then rhythm and blues started to take shape, setting the stage for something even bigger: rock and roll. By the early 1950s, swing had lost its grip on popular music. Young people wanted something different. Rock and roll was loud and exciting. It had an energy that felt new, and it didn't have the polished, controlled sound of swing. Artists like Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly were rising stars, pulling music in a completely different direction. Television also changed the entertainment industry. Swing had thrived in live dance halls, but TV favored solo singers and smaller bands. The world was moving forward, and swing was struggling to keep up. Few artists felt this shift as deeply as the Andrews Sisters. Patti, Maxine, and Laverne had been superstars during the war, selling millions of records and giving soldiers music to hold on to during dark times. Their harmonies were tight, their performances full of energy, and their songs, like Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, became wartime anthems. But when the war ended, their music started to fade from the charts. They tried to keep up by experimenting with new styles. In 1950, they even became the first artists at Decca Records to record a gospel album. But their core audience was moving on, and their biggest hits were behind them. Their last major success came in 1951 with Sparrow in the Treetop, a duet with Bing Crosby. It was catchy and fun, and it reached number 8 on Billboard's Best Sellers chart. But the music world was changing, and novelty songs like this didn't have the same impact anymore. After that, the sisters struggled to find another big hit. In 1953, Patti Andrews made a decision that sent shockwaves through the music world. She left the Andrews Sisters to go solo. What made it worse was how her sisters, Maxine and Laverne, found out, not through a heartfelt conversation, but from gossip columns in the newspapers. The betrayal cut deep, and the fallout was immediate. For 2 years, the sisters barely spoke. Their once unbreakable bond, formed over years of performing together, seemed shattered beyond repair. Patti had flirted with a solo career before, recording songs like "I Can Dream, Can't I?" and "I Wanna Be Loved." But those songs had still been released under the Andrews Sisters' name, with Maxine and Laverne singing backup. Going fully solo was different. It wasn't just a career move, it was a declaration of independence. The timing made things even more painful. Their parents had died just a year apart, Olga in 1948, Peter in 1949, leaving the sisters emotionally raw. On top of that, their longtime arranger Vic Schoen had moved on, and behind the scenes, arguments over money and creative control were already straining their relationship. Patti later admitted that the tension had become unbearable. "We had been together nearly all our lives," she said in a 1971 interview. "We were at each other's throats all the time." Maxine and Laverne tried to continue as a duo, even touring Australia, but it was clear something was missing. The Andrews Sisters weren't just a group, they were a unit, and without Patti, it wasn't the same. Their breakup wasn't just another case of a band falling apart, it was a painful example of how ambition, family loyalty, and miscommunication can collide, leaving behind resentment that never fully fades. Patti's decision to go solo wasn't the only thing driving a wedge between the sisters. Her marriage to Walter Weschler in 1952 made things even worse. Weschler had been the group's pianist before becoming Patti's husband, and soon after, he became their manager. His approach to handling the sisters' career was controversial. He pushed for Patty to be paid more than Maxine and Laverne, arguing that she was the star. That financial favoritism created a deep rift. Weschler also fueled Patty's solo ambitions, encouraging her to step away from the group. Maxine openly blamed him for the breakup, and their feud wasn't just private. Lawsuits started flying, adding legal battles to their already fractured relationship. Years later, Patty defended her husband, saying he had always acted in her best interest. But there was no denying that his involvement had permanently changed the family dynamic. Despite the turmoil, Patty and Weschler stayed married for nearly 60 years, right up until his death in 2010. In some ways, he was the one constant in her life. But his legacy in the Andrews sisters' story was far more complicated. His management style and financial decisions made Patty successful on her own, but left behind a family that would never fully heal. As if things weren't already messy, the sisters' relationship took another hit after their parents passed away. Their deaths sparked a legal battle over the estate, and Patty sued Laverne for a bigger share of the inheritance. Maxine was devastated. After everything they had been through, the idea of taking each other to court over money felt like the ultimate betrayal. The timing couldn't have been worse. Both Maxine and Patty were going through divorces, and their careers were already in decline after the breakup. The lawsuit didn't just divide the family, it shattered their public image. To the world, the Andrews sisters had been symbols of harmony, the sweethearts of World War II who kept spirits high with their close harmonies and upbeat songs. Now, fans were reading about bitter disputes and lawsuits. The contrast was heartbreaking. Laverne, the eldest, often played the role of peacemaker, but not even she could stop the damage. The lawsuit became one more reason why the sisters never fully reconciled, even as the years passed. For all their success, selling over 75 million records, their story was becoming one of missed opportunities and unresolved grudges. Then, in 1954, something happened that shook everyone. Maxine was hospitalized after swallowing 18 sleeping pills. The official story was that it was an accident, but many suspected otherwise. The weight of losing her sister to a solo career, the financial disputes, and the crumbling of everything they had built together had taken its toll. Just a year earlier, she had been on tour with Laverne, trying to keep their act alive. Now, she was fighting personal demons in a hospital bed. For fans, the news was shocking. Maxine had been part of one of America's most beloved musical acts. To hear that she was struggling behind the scenes was a reminder that fame doesn't shield anyone from heartbreak. In 1956, they decided to reunite. It was a chance to bring back the success they once had. But the music industry had changed. Rock and roll had taken over, and younger artists like Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry were dominating the charts. The sisters signed with Capitol Records, where Patty was already a solo artist, and they tried to adapt by adding light rock influences to their music. But audiences wanted the old Andrews sisters sound. Between 1956 and 1959, they recorded a dozen singles and 3 albums, including one with 1920s songs arranged by Billy May. None of them made much of an impact. They still had fans and performed in top venues like Las Vegas and London theaters. But their time as chart toppers was over. On top of that, the old tensions between them never completely went away. The reunion was a struggle, and it was clear that their place in the music world was slipping away. Then, in 1966, everything changed. Laverne was diagnosed with liver cancer. She was only 55. As the eldest sister, she had always been the steady force holding them together. She wasn't just a voice in their harmonies. Her deep contralto gave their music richness. But she was also the one who kept Patty and Maxine from falling apart. Laverne kept her illness private for as long as she could. When she could no longer perform, the Andrews sisters came to an end. She passed away on May 8, 1967, at her home in Brentwood, California. Without her, there was no group left to save. They had sold nearly 100 million records and earned 19 gold discs. But their time as a trio was over. Patty and Maxine tried to carry on together, but it wasn't the same. Laverne had been the glue that held them together, and without her, the old tensions between them only got worse. In 1973, they reunited for Over Here, a Broadway show built on World War II nostalgia that featured many of their classic hits. It was a success, but behind the scenes, nothing had changed. After the show ended, both sisters kept performing in their own way. Maxine found success in musical theater, starring in productions like Swingtime Canteen, while Patty made appearances on TV and cruise ships. But despite working together on occasion, like when they received a star on Hollywood's Walk of Fame in 1987, their relationship never fully healed. Maxine passed away in 1995 at 79. Patty lived until 2013, reaching 94 as the last surviving Andrews sister. Their time as a group had ended long before, but their music lived on. Songs like Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy and Rum and Coca-Cola still echoed from the past, reminding the world of an era they had once defined. Patty Andrews carried a regret she never let go of. She wished she had made peace with her sister Maxine before Maxine passed away in 1995. But no matter how much she thought about it, she always came back to the same conclusion. Their differences were too deep to fix. Their feud had lasted for decades, long enough that neither of them knew how to undo the damage. They only saw each other twice in the last 20 years of Maxine's life. The first time was in 1982, when Maxine had a heart attack. The second was in 1987, when they received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Even then, they barely spoke. Their relationship had always been complicated. Patty once said Maxine had been a problem from the day she was born. She refused to explain further, wanting to protect the public image of the Andrews sisters. Maxine saw things differently. She described their relationship as loving but suffocating. The three sisters had spent nearly every moment together. They lived together, traveled together, performed together. There was no space to breathe, no way to step back. Their problems ran deeper than just personality clashes. After their parents died in the late 1940s, a fight over inheritance drove a wedge between them. A few years later, Patty made a decision that changed everything. In 1951, she went solo without telling her sisters first. Maxine and their eldest sister Laverne felt betrayed. They kept performing as a group on and off, but things were never the same. Then came Over Here, a Broadway show that brought them back together in 1975. It should have been a fresh start, but instead, it was the end. A salary dispute led to another bitter fallout, and this time, there was no coming back from it. When Maxine died in 1995, Patty didn't go to the memorial service. She was heartbroken, but she never believed reconciliation had been possible. She carried that feeling until she passed away in 2013, at the age of 94. Maxine had her own regrets. In her later years, she spoke about the way fame had shaped their relationship. She admitted they loved each other deeply, but struggled to coexist. Their rise to stardom had been fast and overwhelming. With more than 75 million records sold, and hits like Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, they became some of the biggest stars of their time. Their music lifted spirits during World War II, but behind the scenes, the pressure was enormous. They performed constantly. They never had time apart. Patty's solo career wasn't the only reason for their fights. Money disputes and management decisions created more tension. Maxine also faced personal struggles. Though she never publicly came out, she had relationships with women at a time when it wasn't widely accepted. Some believe this made her feel even more distant from Patty. Despite everything, Maxine still took pride in what they accomplished. But she never stopped wishing things had ended differently. "I wish I had the ability and the power to bridge the gap between my relationship with my sister," she said. The story of the Andrews sisters is both inspiring and heartbreaking. They rose from a small town in Minnesota to become one of the most successful musical acts in history. They recorded more than 600 songs, had over 100 chart hits, and defined an entire era. But behind the music was a family that never truly found peace. When Laverne passed away in 1967, it marked the beginning of the end. She had been the steady force between Patty and Maxine. Without her, their relationship slowly fell apart. By the time Maxine died, there was nothing left to fix. The years of distance had done too much damage.